Thank you very much, Mr. Ostenfeld and Mr. Lund, for setting the stage for our panel discussion next on this year's theme, the Human and Technology Crossroads for Maritime Safety. Our moderator is Captain Yves van der Bon, Honorary President, the Nautical Institute, Singapore branch. Captain Yves is also the Director of Loss Prevention at the Standard Club. Let's say hi to Captain Yves. And joining him on the panel, we have our keynote speakers, Mr. Steen Lund, Chief Executive Officer of RightShip. Mr. Carsten Ostenfeld, Intertanko Council Member and Chief Operating Officer, Anglo-Eastern Ship Management Limited. As well as Mr. Nick Chubb, Managing Director of TTS. And Dr. Oivind Hallen, Vice President, Research at Syntef Ocean. Ladies and gentlemen, as we move into the panel discussion now, please note that you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to pose questions to our panelists. And for our audience on site, if you have any questions for our panelists, please raise up your hands and we'll pass you a microphone. And with that, I'll hand the time over to our panel moderator. Captain Yves, please.
Thank you so much, Fiona. And good afternoon, good morning again to everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to this opening session of the International Safety at Sea Week. And very much thank you to MPA and ICOPSI to organize this conference. I would like to thank Steen and Karsten for setting the stage during their opening address. I thought those were really interesting points that were raised that I'm sure that we are going to discuss during this panel session. We have prepared a number of topics for you that we will be going through in the next 1 hour. I will try and answer as many of your questions as we can, so please do let them come in as Fiona mentioned. Now, it was mentioned during the opening address that it's quite imperative for the various maritime industry sectors to work together towards a more sustainable future for the industry. Technology is certainly one of the main enablers of a more green shipping. But we need to remain vigilant that we, and with that actually I mean our seafarers, can keep up with technology and vice versa as well. We need to guard against the implementation of new technology, or regulations for that matter, if it would adversely affect the safety of the ship. During this session, we will be discussing this crossroads and raise important considerations for the industry related to pollution, regulatory change, seafarer training, seafarer well-being, and smart data analytics. Now, during the registration process, we asked you all a question: in which areas you would like to see an improvement of technology in order to support the maritime safety? And looking at the results of this poll that you can see now, I'm not particularly surprised that there is a more or less even spread between the various options. That's more or less what we would expect. But I am happy to see that the majority of you, or at least a small majority of you, did choose for crew training to be the more important sector that we need to focus on. And that's something that we are definitely going to discuss further during this session. Now, if we turn to our first topic, and how technology can assist in reducing our carbon footprint and preventing pollution from ships. Not just pollution to the sea, but also pollution to the air. We are aware that a lot of research is required in order for ship operators to be able to meet upcoming regulatory requirements. But there are also concerns in the industry on how the human element can actually keep up with these requirements. And I would like to turn to Nick first for your thoughts on how, on the investment in technology that there is, which areas should we be focusing on?
Thank you, Yves. And for context, we monitor emerging technology trends in the maritime industry. And I would say when it comes to decarbonisation as a sort of first point to look at here, I'd say the good news is that it's sort of day zero for everyone. There's sort of no clear leaders in the field of zero emission shipping, and it's an enormous opportunity for investors and for the industry. But building on what you were saying there, while it's going to be leaders ashore who actually make the decisions about what the future of zero carbon shipping looks like, it will be seafarers who are actually on the ship who are going to act as the interface between the industry and decarbonisation, pollution, and all of that. So I like to sort of think of the decarbonisation issue in a framework of three areas that will require investment. The first is using technology to create immediate operational efficiencies that can reduce emissions. So depending on the research you read, anywhere from sort of 10% to 30% of ton-mile emissions can be eliminated through improvements to operational efficiencies. There's lots of solutions available that exist today. They're quite fast to implement, and they have quite a short payback time. But 9 times out of 10, really, these come back to behavioural change. And there's a couple of examples that have come out recently where anything from sort of 25 to 50% reduction in fuel consumption has come about through enabling behavioural change in terms of how the vessel is manoeuvred. And this really is a human element problem. This is an area where you need to invest. Yes, is in technology, but principally actually it's in the people who are controlling the sticks. The second area is the kind of research that's going to be required to create and then test the fuels of the future. And that's now starting to pay off. We heard obviously last week that Maersk is already ordering vessels that are capable of running on carbon neutral fuels as well as traditional fossil fuels. But again, when you consider the safety of future fuels, those who are at the sharp end of it is the seafarers. It's again comes back to, yes, there is a large amount of research required to understand how we can create fuels in a carbon neutral way, but ensuring the safety of those fuels comes back down to the seafarers, and we need to be sure we're investing in the individuals who are at the front line of that. The third area in that framework, I think, is the kind of development that's going to be required to build the infrastructure for future fuels. So it's one thing that to have vessels that can run on a carbon neutral fuel. It's quite another to have that fuel available anywhere that ships will go in the world. And that's a big potential problem. And again, the safety of that supply chain comes back to the operators on the ground. This is more landside, so it won't necessarily be seafarers, but there's a huge amount of investment required in the human element side. And obviously, we've talked a bit about human element and sort of whether we're doing enough as an industry to keep up with these new requirements. As an industry, we talk about safety and human element being a top priority, but unfortunately, the numbers betray a reality where we actually underinvest, in supporting our crews. We did some research last year for Inmarsat to try and understand investment patterns and also purchasing patterns for human element and safety-related technologies. So from a 10-year period, from 2010 to 2020, startups with a focus on human factors, crew management, well-being, welfare, and seafarer safety, on average attract 4 times less investment than startups focused on vessel machinery performance, so things like engine efficiency, hull monitoring, and hydrodynamic performance. With that as well, businesses that were focused on safety and human performance grow an average 25% slower than businesses focused on vessel machinery and performance. So yes, there's this narrative we have about the fact that we safety is our top priority and that we invest as an industry in the human element. But unfortunately, the reality is that it's not true. The investment is as much as 4 times less. So when we look to the future, it's crucial, obviously, to understand that we absolutely must invest in decarbonisation and other technologies that will improve the industry's environmental footprint. We also must invest in supporting the safety, well-being and performance of people that work on our ships. I think if we don't, our ability to be an environmentally conscious industry will be severely hampered.
Nick, that's really interesting. It's amazing to hear that there is 4 times the difference between more the efficiency kind of in research compared to the human side. And that's really sobering. And Karsten, earlier on you talked about alternative fuels, and Nick already set out, there is quite a lot of options that are available to ship owners in order to try and comply with 2030 or 2050 requirements. It's not going to be as easy as well, I'm saying easy, it probably wasn't that easy, but back in 2020 when you had to choose between going low sulfur or going scrubber, the next choice is going to be a lot more difficult. How do you look at this? And from your perspective, how do you see technology help you with this?
Well, first of all, I would say I fully concur with Nick on his assessment, and I think that was also what I was trying to touch upon in my opening. You know, without the human element of all this, I think it'll be a huge challenge to get going. And it links nicely into my comment about alternative fuel. So we have done a study now from in our company to figure out what is actually coming for the future. What kind of technology do we have to master tomorrow when some owners have done their choice? And we provide the service as ship managers. And our conclusion was the training element and the mindset and the procedures behind it and everything which is required to run future fuels will be on a different level. We come from an industry where we, to some extent, in the good old days, could live with about and close to, and that was sufficient to keep running. But tomorrow we cannot. The equipment on these future technologies, sensor techniques, the feedback signal, the software which runs around this, I think that will require a totally different mindset and a totally different level of training. So to the discussion about which fuel do we think will come for in the long run, in my mind, it hangs a lot into what infrastructure will we see. As you said, Nick, now Maersk have made their bet into methanol. I don't think it's the last time they're going to bet, and I don't think it's the last time many other people will bet. But I think the development of infrastructure in the world will, to a wide extent, drive what kind of fuels is coming for the future.
Thank you, Karsten. Øyvind, if I can come to you, because from your research perspective, you are involved with new technology research, etc. And if I'm looking in particular at for example, the EEXI, CII regulations that are coming up, with these new technologies or new requirements that are being put in place on board of ships, is there a danger to the safety? Do they all work together nicely? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think you introduced my concern quite nicely there, because my concern is on the balance between the changes which are based on environmental perspective and the operability in critical situations. In a way, this becomes a balancing act between the everyday, in quotes, small emissions from shipping and this risk of major incidents. Today's fleet is based on a continuous technology development, continuous evolution of rules and regulations, but more fundamentally on many years of experience gained from practical operation. And from a political perspective, there's a strong focus now on reduced emissions, often with financial support if you do, or financial penalties if you don't. But in the overall design process, this means that some KPIs will be focused more than others, and this holistic perspective may be suffering. I mean, one example with EEDI is that, in effect, it's awarding optimization for performance in calm seas, and this gives reduced harsh weather performance. Other obvious ways to reduce emissions in daily operations, slow steaming has been mentioned. You can go down on engine size, but this means less effect, and equally important, less available torque on the propeller at slow speeds. Other measures, we can go down to a minimum rudder size, or remove or reduce number of tunnel thrusters. Separately, such design changes may not be critical, but if it's taken too far, it will have some serious implications on safety and operability in critical situations. I would not say that the incident of Ever Given is an example in this respect, but the incident can be used to illustrate the dilemma that the industry must face. On one hand, reducing emissions, and on the other hand, maintaining safety, maneuverability, and operability of the fleet. So my perspective is that this is a huge balancing act, and the answer is not given by the political, by the industry ourselves.
Oyvind, thank you so much for that. We lost you there for a short while. But what I think one topic that has been touched on by all of the panelists so far is really the importance of the human part in there and making sure that training is being done for the crew. And what I feel is important there is, on one hand, yes, okay, are we using technology in order to be able to properly train our crew? But on the other hand, is the crew being properly trained to use the new technology? And that is where my concern is. A simple example is the ECDIS installation, which has been on board of ships for so long now, but we are still, when we do accident investigations, are finding issue with the knowledge that the crew has about the limitations when using ECDIS. So there is something there that needs to be improved. Crew, of course, already has a lot of both mandatory and in addition to STCW training that is required to be done. But Steen, if we, from your perspective, how can we bring technology into this, and how can we improve then the training of the crew?
I'm certain that Carsten has better answers to that question than I have, but let me start with a few observations, also building on what Carsten said before, which essentially my first question to the question would be, who do we attract into the industry in the first place? And how do we then ensure that we overlay the basic competence that they bring into the industry with additional competence building? It's interesting to, first of all, live with the proposition that today we have pretty much a singular fuel, an uncomplicated product to handle. And there is no doubt that as we move forward, we won't see just a single future fuel. We'll see a mix of different fuels. So the starting point in terms of who do we attract into the industry and how do we train them has to actually be seen in light of how will the asset look in future. So I think it's a much more complex situation than just, are we optimizing the ECDIS and is the man operating the ECDIS really capable of doing that? I think we're looking at a far more complex vessel. I know we're not going to touch on autonomy and the whole concept of mass today, but again, this is coming to us. This is the light we have to frame how we plan competence building around, because there will be increasing elements of autonomy on the assets that our seafarers will initially be on, and perhaps over time less so. So there's a complexity there that we need to build into our training regimes that's not with us today. And I think it really starts with all the training facilitators, how we take ownership of what is taught to the seafarers at source, as opposed to just bringing them into our system and then starting the competence building from there. When you're then on board the vessel, I guess the way I would look at it would be, no technology should be introduced onto an asset unless it has significant positive repercussions to that asset. You shouldn't have technology there if it doesn't replace a tool that doesn't do as well as the new technology that comes in. And then we're back to the human element again, that there has to be a narrative where the seafarer has an incentive to truly operate that technology at her or his highest level of competence. So we need to tell a story about what's in it for the seafarer. And if there's nothing in it except a lot of extra work at that point where where that individual operates the technology, then there has to be another element of the narrative taught to the seafarer that it has to be good for another purpose than reducing an exposure of the seafarer from a safety aspect, or reducing time spent on a task. And I think understanding that that narrative has to be shared so that there's an incentive where the seafarer truly understand what is my role in this and why is what I'm doing of value, is something we need to be preoccupied with as we understand, again, the deeper aspect of the human element. On the positive side, the advent of technology also democratizes teaching opportunities. Years back, we were used to having to bring the seafarers off the vessel and bringing them into crew conferences and physically having that learning space. That's not at all necessary any longer. We have AR and VR that is being built onto or into products so that opportunities of learning on the vessel itself exist, or opportunities of learning next to a new technology being introduced exist. And I think that's extremely gratifying once we truly embrace that.
I would agree with you on that, Steen, and I think it is important that those new ways of teaching are actually being really spread out more to more training centers. At the moment, I agree with you, it is there, but it is not being used sufficiently, in my opinion. But like you say, Karsten, I'm sure is going to have an opinion about crew training. And I know, Karsten, that Anglo is using quite some innovative ways of training your crew. So would you want to elaborate on that?
I might even be able to offer a strong opinion if you want. So, no, but you're absolutely right. I think that the training over years, of course, has evolved, as Steen was also pointing at. And I think most today, I think, are using simulators, have been using them for long. They are, of course, much, much better today than there was in the past. So this is one thing. The latest, relatively new, is, of course, virtual reality, which is touching on this generation of seafarers, which we are getting into our industry right now. For them, I think that's pretty normal. This is how we can pre-train them into working on a ship to figure out how things works. And then virtual reality is a very good tool. It can be spread very fast to many people. And the last thing what we have been doing is actually to developing a gaming app also, where we kind of again try to touch on this generation of seafarers, where they can learn more about ship techniques and how to act and engage on a ship through gaming, basically. It's all good and solid, but it has an element of gaming, which I think is exciting and of course a way to get in touch with the younger generation of seafarers. So the way we do it, I think, is on one side a little bit forward pointing, but it's also coming back to some basic skills with the fact that we actually have an academy where we train young people age 18. Where they simply get the basic seamanship. And then I would also point out one thing, and this is no matter what we do, coming on board a ship and actually being there, learning the whole package will still be there. So we can do a lot of training before people actually get on the ship, but the thing of getting out there, smelling the sea, feeling the wind, being with your colleagues, being part of the team, all this has to happen on board a ship. So no matter what we put on board, I think this element of training will still stay, in my view.
Yeah, definitely. The practical experience will always count for so much more. But it's interesting that the new AR or VR technologies, let's hope that they are able to give some kind of feel of what it is, and that the level of understanding by the seafarer is increased that way. Øyvind, from your perspective, are we doing training correctly?
Yeah, well, there's there are many answers to that. To me, that question has many sides. On one hand, are we training the crew properly? On the other hand, are we designing systems that properly support the crew? And then are we sufficiently looking at the day-to-day work situation of the crew?
Oyvind, are you still with us? He seems to have gone off again. Sorry for that. Nick, can we get your thoughts perhaps on the crew training?
Absolutely. To make an attempt to answer the question you asked, Oyvind, my very short answer would be no. I don't think we are doing crew training correctly, consistently across the entire industry. And I think if we were, the level of safety critical incidents that we see in the industry every year would be much lower. I think there's a huge amount that we could be doing to better embrace technologies that have been mentioned, for example, by Carsten, things like augmented and virtual reality and simulation. I think when you take simulation to its fullest extreme, it's possible to send astronauts into space for the first time with them being fully briefed, fully drilled. They know exactly what to do because it's been simulated so many times over a number of years. I'm not suggesting we should do that, and I fully agree with Carsten's point that you don't get the real understanding of what life at sea is like until you've got the wind in your hair and you're there with your crew on your ship. I wholeheartedly agree with that, but I think there is a huge amount more that we could do to drill those kind of safety critical scenarios on board vessels through simulation in a way that's safe, cheap, repeatable. That I think that has a massive potential to reduce the impact of safety critical incidents on board just by improving how people respond to them. I think that is tied into a whole range of issues related to STCW and the kind of lack of flexibility that sits within that, which is possibly a can of worms we don't want to open just now, but I think it's worth flagging that at a regulatory level, there's a lot of inflexibility when it comes to training.
Thank you, Nick. Carsten, can I come back to you for a second? Or we have Oyvind back again? Oyvind, sorry, do you want to...
Yeah, I think we had an example of insufficient training in technology. From our perspective, coming back to this training, what we see as important is that training is specific. What we've seen in several occasions for Norwegian offshore vessels and inland ferries is that in the critical situations, humans act based on previous experience. So in a critical situation, many fall back on what they did to handle a similar situation on a previous vessel with a previous system. So the core of it all, what makes training so difficult is when a new system is introduced, how to transfer manuals and e-learning into true experience. And that's a very difficult challenge. And then there's a second aspect. What we learn from, that's part of the research findings, what we learn from are the small incidents and the near accidents that are avoided. It's not the major accidents that hit the headlines. It's the smaller incidents and the near accidents, and these should be recorded and used in experience sharing, but current practice is quite mixed in that respect. So our perspective is that familiarization is the real key. From our perspective, crew training need to be ship-specific, not using simulators for a generic class of ships, but simulators for the ship. And second most important, as also Nick touched upon, is to allow proper familiarization when new crews are taking over. So this is not something that actually is technology-driven or any rocket science at all. But it's so difficult to implement in practice. I guess the day-to-day financial constraints play a part in this. But moving from generic to specific and moving from, let's say, knowledge to experience, that's the key challenge to get crew to really function properly in critical situations.
Thank you, Oyvind. Carsten, sorry, I want to come back to you for a second because we received a question from our audience, We've been talking about human element now for so many years, but it's still, every incident that we see, the human element is still there as an issue. Is there something that we can do with the use of AI or technology to get some meaningful compliance, as Captain Atul mentioned? What are your thoughts on this?
Actually, I was thinking we might be missing one side of this and this is more like what happens in the team, because when you analyze incidents when they have happened, I think there's often an element of the human interaction as part of it. It's not only about technology, it's not only about not knowing, it was also because the situation you were in. And my thoughts is always, we should kind of think the context our people are in, and then you should work on making them as successful as possible in that context. And I think sometimes we miss the context. If you add it all up, it's late. I think people have been awake for long. They have the pressure, perceived pressure. It doesn't even have to be a real pressure. It could just be a perceived pressure on board. There might be something about power distance, and so on. So I think it's much about this, getting it right across the team, which also will create improved safety and kind of better awareness. And I think also kind of also touch on all what Øyvind and Nick were saying about how do we train people, how do we ensure that they get the experience which is already on the ship. I think that can be provided by either the people who are already there, has been there longer than the ones who joins, or alternatively, of course, in a handover situation. But I think this about the team dynamics, I think, is very important in this discussion. And that might even be the thing which also creates a compliance. If you manage to get this culture going on board across ships.
Thanks, Carsten. Nick, if I can come back to you. And earlier on, it was mentioned by a few people, I think you included. There's so much training going on. There's so many things going on board. But what about the fatigue management of our crew on board? And of course, from your perspective, you are the fatigue expert, so to say. But I think this is an important topic on seafarer well-being. How do you see technology helping us with that aspect?
Thank you, Yves. Well, I'm certainly no expert myself, but at Thetis we've been fortunate enough to run a number of innovation programs related to fatigue in the last year or so. And perhaps to answer your question, it might be helpful to talk about some of those. So the first is a project that we've been running with Shell and Inmarsat, where over the last year, we've been trialing an intelligent fatigue management system. So it combines digital work and rest hours that are easy for the crew to fill out and use, and sort of automate a lot of the compliance process and headaches that come with that. That's combined with wearables that the crew wear on board that track fatigue and various sort of fatigue and health related markers. Over time, what that project has made it possible for us to do on a single vessel is to sort of create a kind of traffic light system for the crew overall. So that's able to kind of show senior leaders on board, and also the fleet management team ashore red, amber, green traffic light of how fatigued the crew is, to give them an early warning of when they may need to react to do things like crew changes. We've also been working in the last year with Lloyd's Register's Safety Tech Accelerator to take a fatigue risk management system to market. That uses a new type of cognitive monitoring technology. What it's able to do is just sort of by taking a quick video with your smartphone, it is able to recognize how cognitively fatigued you may be by tracking the human eye. And what we found when we've been working on this is that systems like this allow ship and port operators to take much more of a risk-based approach to fatigue management. So it's actually unique to every individual, rather than simply sort of working to prescribed work and rest hours. And essentially what this enables is for an operator, wherever they are in the world, to be able to understand when or where or during what type of operations that fatigue risks are highest, and to be able to put mitigation measures in place at the right time, rather than just saying the crew are fatigued, because we know that the crew generally are fatigued because they're doing sort of 24-hour, 7-day-a-week operations. On that, one thing I would say is that I think the maritime industry is increasingly out of step with other safety critical industries. Aviation, rail, healthcare, nuclear, a whole host of other safety critical industries have moved over to this sort of new way of managing fatigue, where it's based on risk rather than prescriptive rules. And I think fully embracing that approach is not a technology question. It's a question of regulation, and I think it comes back to IMO. It comes back to flag states to look at how these approaches could improve safety, rather than just working within this very prescriptive framework that bluntly doesn't work. And I think tying that back to training, it does come back to sort of so many of the issues that we see in the industry stemming from that kind of lack of flexibility from IMO and STCW.
Thanks, Nick. One solution is also to have sufficient people on board of ships, of course. That'll help out with fatigue management as well. And Steen, I want to come back to you on a similar topic. Earlier in your keynote, you mentioned that RightShip is going to set up a health score or a well-being score as part of the self-assessment. You explained it a little bit earlier on, but can you elaborate maybe a little bit more on some of the underlying factors that make up that score, and would fatigue be one of these?
I'm not sure I used the word score. If I did, that was unintentional, or maybe I was looking at the future, because the intention is not really to focus that effort on a score per se, as much as it is to focus the industry on getting involved and getting transparency around crew well-being. The starting point is essentially to articulate a code of conduct that both charterers and ship managers, DOC holders, can sign up to, and the demand on either of them will of course be different. And then relative to that code of conduct, there will be a self-assessment consisting of quite a few chapters. I think we are at chapter 8 or so, detailing many different elements of how you define crew well-being. And the intention is then to flesh out the outcome of that self-assessment onto the platform to provide transparency to the industry, where not initially in the form of a score, but in the form of a transparency whether that particular self-assessment reveals a DOC holder to have a basic compliance with the code of conduct, all the way up to the highest level of advanced compliance with that code of conduct. In doing that, of course, the DOC holder can benchmark against other DOC holders to see where is the industry going on these parameters. Each of the parameters will have specific value sets defined so that we as an industry can see how are we doing on the various elements that define the aggregate of a safety outcome for the seafarers, or well-being outcome, as it were, for the seafarers. So that's the intention with it. Will it then over time grow into a score? That depends on the industry. We are making our platform available for the industry to use, and again for users of the assets in terms of charterers to come together to have the same level of transparency and insight into the vessel as the owner and the ship manager would have, but who may not in the normal course of conversation or exchange reveal a status. That's what we are trying to make that's the whole idea really of a digital platform, to make that transparently available to everyone. And from there then decisions can be made. If a charterer believes that a certain level of excellence should be attained within specifically care for the crew, well then they will vote when they do their charters, and that can potentially become then a part of the definition of the vet, so that we could add that as another element to the vetting procedure, and if that's what the industry would like to see. I think it's really, really important to embrace that this is not an element of coming at it with a stick, but it's more coming at it with using transparency as the carrot that can allow the industry to learn from each other. There will be a tremendous amount of best practice put into this. And I appreciate that it might sound offensive when I say that we are hosting 57,000 vessels and we truly see the good, the bad, and the ugly out there. And I feel as an industry, we often come at this from the angle of how can we make good better. I think it's very useful, I'm sure, to have wearables that can show us the whereabouts of a seafarer on a vessel. I'm sure it will get us somewhere within that scope. But I'm also certain that there are a lot that would fall in the category of the ugly that would need to take far more basic steps towards truly showing and living a care for the crew that will have a far greater impact on whether that crew gets home or not safe, without injury, without accident. So perhaps technology can also be used in different ways to help that, if we all believe that the real mission we should be on here is to enhance that opportunity for the seafarer to have a safe working day and return home unharmed, then having policies. So this is what we are seeking to build into the crew well-being score, having a commitment towards whether you provide data and telephony access to a seafarer will have a direct impact on that person's well-being. I'm sure none of us that are land-based in our jobs would find it particularly cool if someone came and said we were disallowed to use our mobile phone for a week. Now that's the reality that many of the seafarers are living without a contact in this trying environment we're in today with their loved ones at home. That's not reasonable. So perhaps we could introduce specific definitions of how that should look for you to define that you have care for the crew. Perhaps we could introduce and learn from the best of the best how a mental health assessment should look like, and how we can benefit from the outcomes of those mental health assessments to ensure that we catch anything untoward before it turns into be a hazard for that crew or for the colleagues of that crew on board the vessel. So in that sense, I'm greatly enthusiastic about the availability of technology to help that journey. I just think we should aim really, really high, as opposed to the small elements that might be comforting but not make a huge difference in the industry.
I really do hope that it will work out the way you envisage it. I think it would be really good for the well-being of seafarers in general. We had one question that came in from the audience, which I wanted to ask Karsten for your brief thoughts before we move on to the next topic. Actually, it's a double question, and it's one of these questions we quite frequently see during this kind of debate. How can we standardize the crew training on board? With so many different ways of providing training to the crew, is there a way that we could standardize this training, or is that towards where we are moving now with the VR and the AR? And at the same time, and this is the age-old discussion between the airline industry and us, why is our equipment on board of ships not more standardized? And is there anything that technology can do to try and more standardize the equipment that we are using on board? Karsten.
That was a very simple double question. Thank you very much. Do you hear me?
Yes, Karsten, we can.
Okay, because on my screen you're all frozen. So start with the latter, standardization of equipment. Well, that's a very, very long discussion. I would think to some extent that we will get a certain standardization simply due to the fact that there will be a kind of consolidation of equipment manufacturers. So we can see that 15 years ago there was more people, now there are lesser. And I think with the next generation of technology, I think there will also be less to choose from, at least from major components. So there we could talk about a certain standardization. The question on can we standardize training? well, of course, to some extent we can, but I think also that's also a little bit depending on the segment you work in. I think what is it you're up against with whom, and how do you tackle the training? So I would say on let's say 10 years plus basis, I would not believe that you'll get to standardized training. That I think will stay as a dream, because we are still too far away from anything near the airline industry, where they have two manufacturers of two standard pieces of equipment. You know, if we add on the whole localization of component sourcing from China to Korea to Japan to Europe in some cases, I think it's a pretty long drive to get there. But on the major components, I think there will be some training. I'm less optimistic.
Thank you, Karsten. I know it was easy to ask of me, but I know it's a difficult answer to provide. Before we move on to the smart data analytics, I would like to put up a poll for our audience that they can have a look at and answer while we go through the next question. And that's on, on what is that? To give us your thoughts on what the technology providers should focus on next in order to improve the safety on board of ships. So I will let the audience think on that, but then I want to talk for a short bit about the data analytics. And this has been mentioned, and I know, Steen, in your presentation and throughout your various answers, you've touched upon all these different ways that technology or analytics can be used in order to improve. But I want to go to Øyvind on this first. And Øyvind, from your perspective, what's the next step now? We are doing all these different things with data. Where do we need to go with analytical process?
Yeah, I would like to come back to Karsten's comments first, because the question about standardizing training, I think one of the main benefits we'll see from the next generation of technology is that will allow for not standardization of training, but for specific training for each particular vessel. And according to our research, that's where you can have a real benefit, that people learn what are the right responses for their job on board that particular vessel with those particular systems. And that's something that's much easier done with what technology we see coming in future rather than what we have seen so far. But then looking at the different trends on this data analytics, you have the development of digital twins on one hand, you have the introduction of machine learning or the widespread use of machine learning, and thirdly, this push towards autonomous ships. And the common denominator, of course, are data and the possibilities we now have for extensive data harvesting and analysis. Now, each of these are not in their own sense particularly new. Digital twins is nothing new. It's a data representation of ship with all its different systems, integrating both classical models and live data. What is new is that we now have more computing power, better possibilities for connecting models, better measurements data, and we can create models that actually represents a live ship. Machine learning, same, is not its old news. Again, it's the access to data and the computing power that is really starting to make a difference. And then there's push towards autonomous ships. To me, autonomy is not a goal in itself. Well, developing the technology is a goal. Opening those possibilities is a goal. But the fundamental aim is to develop efficient transport systems. And then autonomy is, or maybe one very important tool in that toolbox. So where I see the real difference coming in principle is how accessible data is becoming. Instead of ship systems only being developed by the big guys, it's becoming increasingly possible for startups and smaller companies to get access to data and create systems that really make an impact. So to me, the next step in this big data analytical evolution is this new ecosystem of applications. In a way, you may be seeing an App Store or Google Play for shipping. So a much bigger variety and, let's say, a new influx of brain power coming from the availability of data and the possibility to use new computer systems. But then I'd like to raise one concern as well. For both digital twins and for autonomous systems, there's a flip side that's often overlooked. Perhaps it's not cool enough, I don't know. And that's the importance of the classical physical models that has to be at the base of it all. I mean, from the oil and gas industry, machine learning has been tested and tried for quite a while. And they were moving away from systems that are based on clean sheets, just the system learning based on data. What's seen now is to create real digital twins, autonomous systems, and data analytics, especially related to safety at sea. It is important to have a solid basis on classical ship physics, classical environmental behavioral science, classical tank model tests, and then you can use machine learning to continuously update and improve predictions, support operational decisions, support commercial decisions. And in all this discussion of how great technology is and how wonderful it is to move forward, I mean, the good examples don't need to be high-flying or particularly advanced. Just a comparison between real fuel consumption and a theoretical optimal fuel consumption would clearly provide a lot of value. Weather routing and other relevant examples with limited power, this would be increasingly important to avoid critical situations. And then if you start considering future propulsion solutions, such as wind-assisted propulsion, then weather routing would clearly be essential, but even more dependent on having accurate physics at the base. So I would say that we have a real interesting future coming where these classical aspects of ship operation, ship design, and the new digital solutions will merge. And then where we will see hopefully see a new ecosystem of technology providers that are emerging to support our businesses.
Thank you, Øyvind. That's fascinating. I'm going to raise 2 points on this because we don't have sufficient time to go through it in more detail. But with the implementation of more data on board and the analytics that is being done, we do need to be careful that we are not getting into a Big Brother type of situation. That's something to be careful about on board of ships. I know that there are certain seafarers who are concerned about that. That's one point I wanted to raise. And the second point I wanted to raise on this, which sadly we won't have time to discuss, in order for data analytics to work, we really need to have a lot more companies that are willing and actually doing the sharing of data. At the moment, we still see too many companies that analyze their own data, but that are not willing to actually share it with others and analyze it on a bigger scale. I think that's something that needs to change. We have 8 minutes left. A big red clock is telling me here. And I want to move into the last part. And could we bring up the results of the poll that we just asked everyone? And can I then ask my various panelists to give your opinion on what we are seeing here? The majority of people are choosing providing a meaningful analysis, not an abundance of data. That ties along nicely with what we said. And as the second point, a simplified process for the entire supply chain. Nick, can I start with you? Your brief thoughts on this and a closing thought for the discussion that we've had.
Yeah, sure. So I think it all actually comes back to culture. This first, yeah, being able to provide meaningful analysis and not just a huge amount of data. It's certainly a growing issue, and I think that's something where what you need to do is create a culture that brings everyone together around these data sets to look at where efficiencies could be found, where they could tie back to real sort of meaningful change that can happen on board the vessel. That requires an investment in skill. It requires an upskilling, not just those who sit in a data science lab somewhere in your operation, but also ops people throughout the organization, seafarers who are on the ships. It is an entirely new way of kind of looking at these issues that we need to embrace. And I think building on that to sort of come back to closing thoughts, and also just sort of tying in your point about Big Brother, Eve. The way I view technology is that it's an amplifier. It allows you to do things faster, cheaper, and at a bigger scale, but it's completely neutral. So no technology is inherently bad or good. It's about how it's used, and it will just amplify the outcome. So, for example, nuclear technology can either be used to build homes or it can be used to make bombs. Same with social media. It can be used to connect families together or it can be used to subvert democratic elections. And if we bring this concept back to ships and the human element, it all comes down to trust and culture. So if you're operating in a low trust environment where safety culture is really poor, and there's a high blame culture and people cover things up, adding technology is just going to amplify that poor safety culture, and it's going to amplify the feeling that Big Brother is watching, and it's going to amplify all of the issues that we've talked about that come from trust. And by contrast, if you're already operating in a high trust environment where the safety culture is strong, Oyvind mentioned about sort of recording high frequencies, low impact incidents and accidents, things like near misses, making sure they go back into some kind of data analysis and then come back to action on the ship. You can throw all the technology you want at that, but if you don't have the crew actually trusting that process, it's not going to happen. So if you've got a strong safety culture, technology will amplify it, and it will make it easier for seafarers and management teams to work together, and it will actually increase trust and transparency. So I think the first thing to concentrate as we come away from this is to focus on improving trust, improving the culture across the fleet management organization and also on board the ships themselves, and then throw the technology on top. And I think that is a route to kind of continuous improvement when it comes to safety. If that trust doesn't exist, then all you're going to do is create bigger problems for yourselves down the line.
Thank you, Nick. Karsten, can we come to you for your closing thoughts?
Yes, you can, Yves. And I would say, in general, I'm optimistic. I think I think on technology, I think, and the whole data provision that's going to develop, and I think it's going to develop fast. I think we're going to get tools at our hands we have not had before. It's going to come. I think the whole connectivity, and which we're also touching upon, just imagine what happens at the time when the vessels are connected constantly online. We can teams with them without any limitations and so on and so forth. When that happens, I think that's going to open for new ways of doing things. I'm also sure we're going to get to reduced emissions, which is kind of the overarching big target for everyone. We will get there. I think the manhood will find ways. And I'm with Nick 100% on the people side. Where I'm still optimistic is in the sense that we actually know what to do. We know all the things in the team. The big question is, how do we implement it? How do we actually get it? How do we get the good, solid safety culture based on trust among team members on the ship or between ship and shore? How do we actually do this? But it's not that we cannot do it, because we have done it, but we just need to implement it at a much wider scale. So that will be my final conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Karsten. Oyvind, can we come to you for your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you for a very good discourse. And the recommendations from let's say, my research perspective are actually quite simple. To get from this abundance of data to analysis that has a real impact for business. And if you can prove that data improves business, then we have a case that's just going to escalate. And then what I see as a interesting development in future is that this development lets us make models that are specific for each ship, which will then include improve the crew training and safety. Efficiency. So specific models rather than the generic we are seeing today. And that analytics will be able to drill down to have ship-specific models rather than generic models at the base. And then I see, like Carsten, I see a really interesting future where you have, they say, the classical part of the operation, which will never change, merging with the new digital developments that are accelerating fantastically all around us. And we will see a new ecosystem of companies, technology providers, crew training providers that will be emerging that will really make a difference for our complete operation.
Thank you, Øyvind. Steen, can we have your thoughts?
Has to be fast. I can see 108, it says in red.
That's why I came last to you.
Number one, we talked about the human element. And I'm quite convinced that we have talked a lot and we have done less. I've been in this industry for 34 years. This year was the first time I met the first PhD in the human element with a ship owner. First time. I'm sure I don't meet everybody here in the industry, but that was quite telling. And this lady had some very, very different approaches to how they, in that ship owner, were focusing on safety for the seafarer. So I can only encourage all of us to embrace that wholeheartedly. I think there's a lot to be done, a lot to be harvested, that everyone will benefit from. Obviously, as RightShip, we are a digital platform, so we are a great believer in technology. We can also see that there is challenging times, sometimes when there is a perception that the data is not safe to be shared. We often come back to that element. If I part ways with my data, am I exposing myself legally or in other ways? And I'm also certain we've seen an incredible amount of good examples how that can be overcome. Neutralizing the data, having good contracting structures in place that can allow that transportation of data in and out of the ecosystem. So again, an area I think I would encourage, don't be afraid, find elements, find tools that allow you to share. And obviously, we'd like to be part of that journey in helping the industry to fulfill its mission to have a safer working environment for the seafarers.
Thank you, Steen. I got one message here, and we would like to close with a question from our live audience here, which is really interesting. Captain Kunal, would you like?
Thank you, Yves, and thank you to the moderator and the panelists. It's more of a comment rather than question arising from what Nick mentioned earlier. The 4 times, which Yves, you also noted that the amount of investment the industry is willing to do for vessel assets versus people. And my comment is not more on the training part, but rather well-being part, because training has been there for a very long time. You can add in all the bells and whistles with all the VR and AR. If the well-being of the individual is not taken care of, you can keep going 30 years down the line. I guarantee you, as an investigator, we'll still be talking about the same issues come what may. So it all boils down to the well-being of the individual. Training and all that can add on to the element, but I think we need to focus on the well-being. So that's more of a comment, but thank you to the panelists for bringing that topic up. Thank you.
Thank you, Kunal. And I think this goes back very much towards what Carsten was saying earlier on. If we cannot even do our crew change properly, why are we bothered about trying to invent new technology? So I think really we do need to focus a lot, as you say, on the well-being, on our human element, on our seafarers on board. And with that, I very much would like to thank all of my panelists for giving up their time, for sharing their valuable information with the audience. I would like to thank MPA for organizing this event and allowing us to come and share our opinions. And very much thanks to you, the audience, for dialing in and for asking your questions. I know you've asked me a lot more questions. I wasn't able to get through all of them, but I hope you found this an interesting discussion. Fiona, thank you very much.